Do you know that feeling when you finally hit a number that used to feel impossible and you still don't feel peace? You look at the balance and see something like $500,000, and instead of relief, you feel a tightness in your chest. You thought that number would unlock, I can breathe now. But it turns into, what if I lose this? Because let's be honest, you didn't get to $500,000 by luck. You got there through discipline. You maxed your 401k when you could. You said no to vacations. You drove the same car for years. You packed lunch while everyone ordered out. You built this on one day it'll be worth it, month after month with no glamour. And now the money is there. But suddenly you're waking up at 2 a.m. running worst-case movies in your head. What if the market crashes right after I retire? What if I get sick and the bills drain everything? What if I live to 95 and the money runs out at 82? There's a specific point where this changes. And it's not what you think. Most people will tell you just need more, work longer, save harder, cut even more. The problem is simply not enough money. They'll throw out a bigger magic number, 1 million, 2 million, as if anxiety disappears once you add another zero. But here's what they're missing. This anxiety isn't only about money, it's about direction. The smaller milestone that flips everything isn't hitting $700,000 or $1 million. It's understanding the mental mistake that makes your brain look at a solid plan and still feel danger. Because the day your paycheck stops, your brain doesn't register, I'm using what I saved for. It registers, I'm losing. The core concept is this. The real shift isn't your balance going up. It's learning to live with your balance going down without your brain triggering an end-of-the-world alarm. And there's a name for it, loss aversion with extra fuel from anchoring and the money stories you've carried your whole life. My name is Naim, and I study money psychology and financial behavior, why responsible people panic at the worst possible time. Subscribe and hit like if this helps, because today I'll show you the exact mistake, why it's basically automatic, and how to build a $500,000 retirement plan based on math, not fear. And stay to the end, because the most important part is in the last minutes. And it's the difference between enjoying retirement and being trapped inside it. Before I explain why this mistake changes everything, here's the reframe that shifts how you see the problem. You're not ungrateful or paranoid. There's an invisible threshold in a retiree's mind, the day the number stops going up. When the balance rises, your brain reads safety. When it starts falling, your brain reads threat, even if the decline is planned. Most people don't know that threshold exists, so they enter retirement expecting freedom and get hit with guilt, fear, and the urge to freeze everything. And that's when they start making small, just-to-be-safe decisions that feel prudent, but can quietly destroy the entire plan. Think of it like this. For decades, your account was a staircase that only went up. Every paycheck, every 401k contribution, every employer match pushed the number higher. Your brain learned to associate up with safety and up with winning. Then the day you retire, the arrow flips direction. Now you have to withdraw, transfer to checking, and pay for life with the money you saved for exactly this. But your brain doesn't read that as plan. It reads it as loss. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the magic happens in your brain. There's a well-studied mechanism in psychology and behavioral economics called loss aversion. In plain language, losing hurts more than winning, feels good, often close to about double in subjective intensity. So notice what happens to a retiree. While you were working, your statement gave you micro rewards. Up, higher, a little more. In retirement, your statement becomes micro alarms. Down, lower, it's leaving. That's why two people with the same number can live in totally different emotional realities. One sees $500,000 and thinks, okay, this is my engine. The other sees it and thinks, this is a ticking clock. The difference isn't math. It's the brain interpreting direction as danger. And it doesn't stop there. There's a second mental trap that makes it worse. Anchoring. Your brain latches onto the highest number it has seen, say $530,000, and treats it as the new normal. If the portfolio drops to $485,000 during a normal correction, rationally that happens. Emotionally, it feels like $45,000 vanished. That $45,000 turns into a movie in your head. You don't feel volatility. You feel, I lost a car. I lost a year. I'm losing the ground under me. And that feeling pushes terrible decisions at the worst timing. Selling at the bottom, going to cash, abandoning stocks when they're cheap. There's also a third ingredient, maybe the deepest one, that hits a lot of Americans without realizing it. Money scripts. The phrases you heard your whole life, save for a rainy day, don't touch your savings, money doesn't grow on trees. Your brain was trained for decades to accumulate and protect. Spending is always danger. Retirement asks you to do the opposite. It asks you to spend on purpose, with method, without guilt, as part of the plan. That creates an internal conflict. You built an identity as a saver, and now you have to become a user of your own money. It's like training your whole life for a marathon and then sitting in the stands on race day because you're afraid of getting tired. You save to live, but when it's time to live, your brain labels it irresponsible. So you become wealthy on paper and poor in peace. You might think this is just a confidence problem or that an advisor fixes it. And while planning helps a lot, it's not what drives the fear at 2 a.m. when you remember the number can drop. The secret is simpler and more encouraging. You need a system that changes what your brain is seeing. Because if you keep showing your brain one single number that only goes down, it will react like you're losing everything. But if you show it a system with clear jobs, cash for now, stability for soon, growth for later, it calms down. And then you can finally do what the math always wanted you to do. Follow the plan. Here's where the math gets exciting, because it cuts through fear noise and brings you back to reality. Fear speaks in horror movies, but math speaks in probability, margin, and context. And context is exactly what your brain forgets the moment it sees the balance going down. Most people hear $500,000 and picture one single number that has to carry everything by itself. But retirement in the US is rarely one single number. It's a combination: Social Security, portfolio withdrawals, and sometimes a bit of extra income. Once you stack the pieces together, the story changes. The most common withdrawal framework people talk about is the 4% rule. The idea is simple. In year one, you withdraw 4% of your portfolio, then adjust that amount for inflation over time. Historically, that approach has had a strong chance of lasting around 30 years across many scenarios, even through ugly markets. With $500,000, 4% is $20,000 in the first year. That's roughly $1,667 per month coming from your portfolio. And I know, your brain hears that and instantly thinks, that's not enough. But here's what fear makes you forget. That's not your total retirement income. For many people, Social Security becomes the base, and the portfolio becomes the supplement. And depending on when you claim, that monthly benefit can swing a lot. So think like a strategist, not like a panicking brain. If you combine something like $1,600 to $1,700 from the portfolio, with something in the ballpark of $1,800 to $2,500 from Social Security, you're already in a monthly range many people can build a life around. It won't look like your old salary, but retirement isn't designed to feel like your old salary. Here's the shift most people never calculate emotionally. Your expenses change. You're not paying payroll taxes the same way. You're not contributing to a 401k the way you did, and you're not commuting every day. It's like getting an invisible raise, just from not having a worker's cost structure anymore. If your home is paid off, you just removed the biggest monthly bill in many American budgets. If you were saving 15% or 20% of your paycheck for retirement, you don't keep saving the same way once you're actually retired. You're in the spending phase on purpose. That changes the income you need to maintain a similar lifestyle. That's why many planners talk about retirees needing something like 70% to 80% of pre-retirement income to maintain the same lifestyle. It's not a perfect rule, but it's a useful reference because it subtracts work costs and forced savings. So if you made $80,000 a year, you may not need the same $80,000 to live in a comparable way. Once you place that context on top of fear, fear shrinks. Fear compares retirement income to working income and labels it a downgrade, its failure. But in reality, you also removed major pieces of your old budget, so the raw comparison is unfair. Now add flexibility, because flexibility is the silent turbo for $500,000. If you're willing to adjust where you live, your income buys more life without forcing higher withdrawals. The cost of living difference between a high-cost metro and a lower-cost area inside the US can stretch your money by 30%, 40%, sometimes more, purely through geography. And here's another thing your brain hates but you need to hear. The 4% rule is conservative by design. It was built to survive some of the worst historical market conditions, not to maximize comfort in average conditions. Across many historical periods, people following something like it didn't just avoid running out of money. They ended up with more than they started with because markets recover over time. So the real risk isn't only running out. The real risk is being so afraid to spend that you become the person who reaches 85 with a big balance and a small life. You spend decades saving for freedom, and then you use that freedom to keep depriving yourself. That's why this math matters. It's not trying to convince you to spend recklessly. It's trying to stop you from freezing out of panic. Because once you understand what $500,000 actually means inside the American retirement system, you stop treating every dip like a bankruptcy warning. Here's what most people miss when they talk about retirement. The real battle isn't inflation, it's interpretation. You're not fighting numbers. You're fighting your brain reading the balance going down as if the house is on fire. And when you change that reading, you don't just gain peace, you get your life back. Think about what it took to reach $500,000. You built an identity as a protector, a saver, the person who thinks about tomorrow even when no one else does. You became the adult in the room, the one who holds steady, avoids impulses, always has a plan. But now that identity has to evolve or it turns into a prison. Retirement isn't a contest to see who can live with the least for the longest, like austerity earns a trophy. Retirement is when money finally does its job and you have to become a manager with purpose. It's a subtle but deep shift, moving from guardian of the balance to user of the plan. The guardian only knows how to protect a high number. The plan user knows how to fund life with method and calm. And that changes everything because your brain stops labeling every withdrawal as danger. Before this shift, you live in the micro, and the micro drives you crazy. You open the app, the market dips 2%, and your body reacts like you lost years of life in a second. You start treating normal volatility like a disaster signal, and you become hyper-vigilant. You slip into permanent scarcity mode without even noticing. You cut dinners with friends, cut short trips, cut hobbies, cut anything that feels extra, even when it's small. And then the cruel irony happens. You spend retirement guarding money you saved specifically to spend in retirement. And the worst part is it doesn't create peace. It creates fake control. Because you can cut everything and your brain will still generate another what if, another scenario, another threat. So you become an expert at avoiding, but you never learn how to live. After you change the lens, you move from micro to macro. You realize the goal isn't keeping the balance at its peak. It's keeping the system running for decades, through ups and downs. You replace how much do I have today with what process pays me monthly safely for years. That sounds small on paper, but in your body it's huge. When you stop treating each withdrawal like a loss, you can breathe again and feel grounded. You start making decisions without urgency, and decisions without urgency are better decisions. This transformation also changes your relationship with time and deservingness. During accumulation, you live in later. Later I'll travel, later I'll rest, later I'll enjoy. If you bring later into retirement, you create a paradox. You arrive at later and keep postponing. Then you get hit with two kinds of guilt. Guilt for spending and guilt for not living. You feel wrong when you buy a small joy, and you feel empty when you deny everything. That conflict isn't financial, it's psychological. When you make the right shift, you start seeing that security isn't just a number. Security is a system that gives you predictability, permission, and protection from your worst emotional timing. It's stopping the daily negotiation with fear and starting to follow a process designed in calm. Now, the fatal mistake that ruins retirements that were actually fine. This is where most people mess up. A rough market stretch hits and they make decisions from panic. They sell low, go to cash until it feels safe, and turn a temporary drop into a permanent loss. Or they do the opposite, which looks prudent but becomes slow poison. They freeze their entire life. They don't travel, don't visit family, don't say yes to simple experiences because fear stays in charge and always finds a reason. Retirement becomes a bunker, not a season of living. There's a third sabotage too, quieter but just as damaging. Living without structure. You have money but no system that says, this is for now, this is for later, this doesn't get touched. Without structure, every decision becomes drama. Drama becomes guilt, and guilt becomes paralysis. When you make the right transformation, opportunities appear that fear wouldn't let you see. You start saying yes to the things that feed health and relationships because you realize that's wealth too. You stop treating joy like risk and start treating joy as part of the plan. You realize the biggest risk was never only a market crash. The biggest risk was spending 20 years afraid and calling it prudence, as if suffering proves responsibility. And once that clicks, you stop trying to prove you're responsible and you start being responsible the right way, with method and with life. This will make you laugh or cry, because the biggest risk to your retirement may not be a market crash. The biggest risk is having $500,000 and living like you're broke, because you're terrified of the number going down. And that fear doesn't just make you anxious. It pushes you into decisions that can genuinely destroy the plan. The hidden villain is simple. Your brain confuses spending with losing. It sees the balance declining and reads it as failure, like water leaking out of the boat. But retirement is the exact season the boat was built to sail, not to stay anchored forever. Then the most expensive contradiction shows up. You spend 25 or 30 years building wealth to create freedom. And when you arrive, you use that freedom to trap yourself. You guard the money like the goal is to die with it untouched instead of turning it into years of a decent life. Now let me show you the scary math, but in the right direction. If fear makes you withdraw almost nothing, You might keep the balance high for a while, but the invisible cost is that you're trading experiences, mental health, and relationships for a number you're not even using. Picture a very real American scenario. You cut small joys for years. You don't visit family because flights are expensive. You skip a short trip because what if the market drops? You avoid dinners because it's wasteful. Then you reach 85 with a beautiful balance and a collection of I could have, and you can't buy that time back. Even more ridiculous, fear actively destroys value. Because when markets drop, the panicked retiree sells low and moves to cash just until it feels safe. That's the one move that turns volatility into permanent loss, exiting at the worst possible time. Or they do something else that looks prudent but becomes a trap. They rewrite the strategy every year. One year it's stocks, the next year it's all bonds, the next year it's all savings, and it keeps rotating. The plan becomes a reflection of mood instead of a system, and every shift eats returns, eats peace, and creates even more fear. But I get it. You want safety, you want to feel protected, and you spent decades being rewarded for accumulation, so spending feels wrong, irresponsible. You're throwing away the effort of an entire lifetime. But you don't actually want a big balance. You want what the balance represents. You want to wake up without that knot in your stomach. You want to choose your day. You want time with people you love without guilt. If fear blocks that, it steals the purpose of your money. That's why opportunity cost is the lens that changes everything. Instead of, can I spend this? The question becomes, what does it cost to live in fear? Because living in fear costs trips never taken, mental health, and years of life you had the ability to live better. And that's why your plan must be built around your psychology, not just your spreadsheet. You need a system that reduces the pain of watching the number go down, because that pain is the trigger that blows up decisions. The most powerful way to do that is separating jobs, so your brain stops seeing one single bucket draining. Here's the beautiful irony. Person A has $500,000 and lives tense. They check daily, recalculate weekly, avoid everything, and still feel anxious because anxiety always finds a new what if. They spend retirement guarding money, but they never feel safe because safety doesn't grow from fear. Person B has $500,000 and lives with more lightness, not because they ignore risk, but because they organize risk. They keep 12 to 24 months in cash for now, a steadier soon bucket, and a later bucket invested for growth. Their brain can relax because today is protected and the future has time to recover. Here's what will surprise you. You don't need infinite courage to live this way. You just need structured permission, almost a contract with yourself, that turns enjoyment into a responsibility, not a guilt. This isn't about spending out of control. It's about spending intentionally and without shame. So the synthesis is simple. $500,000 isn't a fortune, but it can be enough for many Americans with the right structure. What destroys it isn't a small number, it's bad behavior during fear moments. The difference between surviving retirement and thriving in it is having a system that prevents your brain from grabbing the steering wheel. Start today in a practical way, no drama required. First, build the 3-bucket structure. What covers the next 12 to 24 months, what supports the next years, and what grows for the long term. Second, automate your retirement paycheck, so each withdrawal stops feeling like a manual pain. Third, write your enough number on paper using real expenses, not imagined fears. And fourth, create a fixed monthly life. Line, dinner, hobby, a weekend, gifts, something that reminds you why you worked so hard. Trust me, your future self won't thank you for hoarding and panic. They'll thank you for living with method and peace.